Sorry for that technological difficulty. It always happens, usually at the beginning. So I'm glad it happened at the end. So now you will have four parts. Welcome to part four of four with chapter 22, which is all about World War II. And so we are back with the birth of modern civil rights. And so A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was a civil rights leader, and he was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a union for sleeping car porters. And as I explained in part three before I froze indefinitely, um, sleeping car porters were like your attendants. They worked on the train. Their job was to work on the train. They made sure everyone was comfortable. They did everything. They served your drinks. They served your food. They prepared your bed. They took everything that you needed. And so they form a union with the help of A. Philip Randolph to ensure that they are able to have rights. Okay. In July 1941, 20 plus years before Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph, will call for a March on Washington to demand access to employment, an end to segregation, as well as a national anti lynching law. Now, A. Philip Randolph will say that racial discrimination is not only undemocratic and un American, it is actually pro Hitler. Now, I want to pause there to provide a little bit more context on why he would say that. Why would he compare this leader of Nazism um, to America? Why would he say this is pro Hitler? One thing that's important to note and important for you guys to know is when the Nazis are coming up with their essential like racial eugenics program, and they're trying to decide who is Aryan and who is not Aryan, they look to the United States for a blueprint on how we do this. And so many would send, they would go to colleges and they would study really American life, and they reported back to Germany. And the irony, the irony is that our racial categorization was too strict for Nazi Germany. So, our one drop rule, which essentially said if you have one drop of black blood in you, you are black. The one drop rule was too extreme even for the Nazis. So, for him to say that, I mean, it's very significant. Anyways, um, FDR will issue Executive Order 8802. Executive Order 8802 banned discrimination in defense jobs, and it also established the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or the FEPC, to monitor compliance. So I love to say there was widespread change after this, but again, we're in the 1940s and we still have to go through the modern civil rights movement. And so you guys pretty much know that there's no widespread reform that comes from this order. Now, the double V, what does double V stand for? So, the double V was coined by the Pittsburgh Courier in February 1942. And so, what this double V meant was that victory over Germany and Japan had to be accompanied by victory over segregation at home. And so, when it comes especially to wartime, and we will talk about this more when we get to Vietnam, when it comes to wartime, especially when it comes to Black and Brown people fighting for this nation, one thing that many leaders will say is, how can you fight for freedom abroad when you do not have freedom at home? That will be an intellectual battle within these communities, especially once we get to the civil rights movement and we get to Vietnam and civil rights, well, I'll say MLK falling out of, well, favor for speaking about Vietnam, but I digress. So the double V stands for victory in the war. So victory in the war has to be accompanied by victory at home. So you can't fight for freedom abroad and not have freedom in your own backyard. We get some victory, I would say, in 1944 with a case known as Smith versus Allwright. Smith v. Allwright. Is a case in which the Supreme Court outlawed something called the all white primary, which kept blacks from voting. So, the all white primary, in this primary, only white people were able to vote. But in 1944, the all white primary is banned. However, there are other ways that black people are kept from voting, but this is, in the law. Also in 1944, a Swedish social scientist comes to the United States and writes a book called An American Dilemma, where he says that uh, I'm sorry, let me go back. An American Dilemma was written in 1944 by a Swedish social scientist by the name of Gunnar Myrdal. And Myrdal comes to America. He really studies race and the racial conflict in America. And he writes this book. And in this book, he says that racism in America is so complete. It's not just the beliefs of a couple of people. It's so complete that it is entrenched in the law. It is entrenched in politics. It is in economics. It's in social behavior. It's in everything. That the American dilemma is racism, because racism pervades really every aspect of American life, whether we're talking about the law with de jure segregation that will, like Plessy versus Ferguson is an example of de jure segregation. It is segregation that is enforced by the law. And if you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson stated that the races can maintain separate facilities as long as those facilities are equal. So it puts separate but equal into the law. Myrdal is like, look, racism is in the law, it is in your politics, it is in your economics, as far as who is able to get a job, who is not able to get a job, who is able to get this type of pay, who is able to be in a supervisory position. He says it is so entrenched in American society that it is American. Right? That racism is American, and that the war made Americans more aware of this contradiction between American values and the American creed and the reality of racial inequality. So Myrdal, in his book, An American Dilemma, says that the government has to take the lead in outlawing discrimination because it's at the top. It's not just at the bottom, it's at the top. It's everywhere. It's pervasive in American culture. It's also at this time that the struggle for civil rights becomes more of an international thing, Black internationalism, or we get Pan-Africanism at this time, where the Black people will link their fate here in America with people in the African diaspora. So, the African diaspora is a term that's used to describe the scattering of people with a single national or religious or racial identity. So the African diaspora, those in the African diaspora are not just Black Americans, it's also Black Brazilians, it's Black Nigerians, Black Ethiopians, Black Brits. That is the African diaspora. It's people of a common lineage, of a common, I would say, racial identity, but we're spread throughout the United States. And so at this time, especially once we get to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Pan Africanism is more. Um, I would say it becomes more it's more not really accepted, but it's more common because Black Americans will link their fate with other Black people. So the issues that we're having of being, post slavery and not having rights, You can very easily, compare that to apartheid in South Africa, and it can be compared to the racial discrimination that is faced by Black Brazilians in Brazil, which can be compared to the plight of Black Brits, right? So um, all of these fates end up being linked together. They will also, these Black internationalists or Pan Africanists will insist that racism originated in the slave trade and with slavery, and it's being perpetuated in the modern age through colonialism. And so W.E.B. Du Bois will, I would say, really shift his views to more internationalism and Pan Africanism. And in your PowerPoint, if you're following along, I have a picture of Du Bois with Kwame Nkrumah, who was the leader of Ghana. W.E.B. Du Bois will actually live out his days in Ghana, and he is actually buried in Ghana. Okay, so let's go back to the war here. So the end of the war. So we'll start with VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe Day. That occurs May 8th, 1945. That is VE Day. And VE Day, May 8th, 1945, marks the formal end to our war with Germany. However, in April, so just the month before, FDR will die from a stroke, April 12th, 1945, during his fourth presidential term. And so at this time, his vice president was Harry Truman. So Harry Truman will take the oath of office and he will become the president after FDR dies again in his fourth term. So during this time, the Manhattan Project had been in development, and the Manhattan Project was a top secret weapons program where American scientists developed the atomic bomb during the Second World War. And so it's in August 1945 that the atomic bombs are dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it is Truman who drops the bombs, not FDR. Again, it is Truman who drops the bombs, not FDR. So August 6th, 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb that detonated over Hiroshima, Japan. About 70,000 people died immediately, and about 140,000 people would be dead from like radiation poisoning and the cancers that come up from that radiation by the end of the year. Before COVID, I had the opportunity to actually go to Japan. And while I was in Japan, I went to Hiroshima. There's a museum that is now in the place where the bomb dropped, and they have tons and tons of artifacts. And one of the, I would say, spookiest artifacts is that they have a stoop, just a regular concrete stoop with maybe, 3 or so steps on it, and all you see is shadow on the stoop, and the shadow is of a person who was vaporized while sitting on the stoop. Um, anyways, 3 days later, August 9th, 1945, the US will drop a second bomb over Nagasaki, Japan, which will kill about 70,000 people. So the fallout from that bomb, it leads really to a lot of questions on whether this is ever, a good way to end a war, because a lot of the times we don't put physical faces on the war and on the toll of it. But after going to this museum and seeing the many children who will die, a 12-year-old girl died not from the bomb, but from getting a really aggressive form of cancer after the bomb was dropped. And you just see all of these faces and these children. And so just food for thought. All right. So continuing. So planning for the post-war world is the last thing that I will talk about. In July 1945, the final Big Three conference will take place at Potsdam. So it involved, the Big Three: Stalin, Truman, and Churchill of Great Britain. Okay. So this will, during this meeting, they will establish military intervention or a military administration for Germany. They will agree to place Nazi leaders on trial for war crimes. In June 1945, representatives of 51 countries met in San Francisco to adopt the UN Charter, which outlawed the force or threat of force as a means of settling international disputes. So I just remembered something that I would talk about that I said I would talk about in like part one or part two. What happens after these people are liberated from concentration camps? Did German citizens know? If I can find the video, I will find it and post it. But once some of these concentration camps were liberated, like Allied forces made citizens go to these death camps. And so they could see bodies stacked up, so they could smell the stench of death. Some of them were made to clean and to try to identify people in mass graves. So Germany was incredibly devastated after World War II, but we'll get more to that in chapter 23. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you next week with another lesson. See you guys later.